What if the greatest mystery of all was hidden in the shadows of your own past? Anthony Eastwood's life is about to unravel, and only the truth can save him. But in this twisted tale of secrets, one question remains: who can you really trust when the darkness speaks louder than the truth? Anthony Eastwood sat in his dimly lit study, his fingers lightly grazing the edges of the typewriter. He looked up, his gaze drifting aimlessly to the ceiling, then down to the floor, his thoughts clouded by an unnerving silence. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes traveled up the right-hand wall, as if searching for inspiration in the old wallpaper's faded patterns. He sighed deeply. With a sudden, almost violent effort, he focused his gaze back on the empty page before him. His mind raced, but his hands were still, poised above the keys, as if waiting for a miracle. The pristine whiteness of the paper mocked him. It was pristine, untouched, a blank canvas, a promise of creativity he could not yet fulfill. In the center, in bold capital letters, lay the title he had chosen with such confidence: The Dark Secret of Mr. Eastwood, A Mystery Unfolds. A strange title, perhaps, but Anthony had felt it had a peculiar charm. It was enigmatic, yet almost whimsical. Anyone who saw it, he thought, would be compelled to ask, The Dark Secret of Mr. Eastwood, A Mystery Unfolds. What could that possibly mean? They would wonder, curiosity gnawing at them, desperate to discover the story behind such a cryptic phrase. A mystery built around something as simple as a cucumber. It could be brilliant. But no matter how hard he tried, the plot refused to reveal itself. He gritted his teeth and thought to himself, this is it, the foundation of a classic mystery. It'll be the perfect story. But each time his mind attempted to form the next step, it faltered. The idea remained elusive, slipping away just as his fingers brushed the keys. Come on, he muttered under his breath. What do I need? A plot. A strong one. He imagined a heroine. Sonia, Dolores. He wasn't sure. A woman with a face like porcelain, her skin pale and flawless, eyes like deep, dark pools, her every movement graceful, but haunted. Yes, he thought, she'll be the heart of the mystery. She'll hold the secret. Sonia, or Dolores, he whispered, as though speaking the names aloud would somehow summon the plot to him. But even as he conjured images of Sonia's tragic beauty, the hero remained a blur. George, or John, something British, something reliable. He was trying to make sense of it all, make the pieces fit, but every time he thought he had a grip on the story, the edges seemed to slip away. The gardener'd need one, of course, to make this cucumber mystery come alive. Maybe a Scottish gardener, grumbling about the frost. A comic relief character, perhaps. But none of it mattered. The characters were stuck. Frustrated, Anthony stared back at the blank page. His fingers drummed on the desk. What if it was something else, he wondered aloud. What if instead of a cucumber it was a Brussels sprout? No, too weird. Maybe a banana. Number A lettuce. His mind wandered aimlessly, and each idea seemed just as absurd as the last. But then, what if it was something else entirely, something darker? He leaned back in his chair, letting the ideas swirl. The more he thought about it, the more he felt trapped. This wasn't working. But there had to be something, a spark, a sign, something to push him forward. He needed a break, a way to break free from this creative block. The phone rang, slicing through the silence of the room. Anthony's frustration flared. He grabbed the receiver angrily, ready to dismiss yet another interruption. But then, the voice on the other end froze him in his tracks. Hello? Is that you, beloved? The voice was soft, hushed, a woman's voice, with a faint, exotic accent. It was foreign, seductive, and drenched in urgency. He hesitated. Who is this? Carmen. The woman's voice trembled, almost as though she were whispering from a distance, barely audible. Listen carefully, beloved. They're coming. I need you. It's life or death. You must come, quickly, at once. Anthony's heart raced. The mystery was unfolding in front of him. But this was something else entirely. What do you mean? Who is this? Carmen, she repeated, as if it were the only thing she needed to say. It is happening. The cucumber. Do you remember the word? They will find me if you don't come. 320 Kirk Street, hurry. It is death if you don't. And then, with a click, the line went dead. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. Anthony stood, stunned. His mind was racing. What was happening? The cucumber. 320 Kirk Street. Who was Carmen, and what did she mean by death? His hand trembled as he slowly set the receiver down. The typewriter before him sat eerily still, waiting. His mystery had suddenly taken on a new, terrifying depth. I'm damned, he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. What have I gotten myself into? As the clock on the wall ticked steadily, Anthony felt the walls of his study close in. The mystery of the second cucumber had taken a strange, ominous turn. The title he had written no longer seemed like a joke, it was now an invitation. But would he dare to answer? Anthony's heart beat faster as the old woman's words echoed in his mind. Cucumber. The word lingered in the air, a strange trigger. But why? Was it a slip of the tongue or something more? Anthony found himself stepping through the doorway, his mind racing. As the door creaked open, he found himself climbing a narrow, dimly lit staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in around him. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. The farther he climbed, the more he felt the sense of dread creeping up his spine. The words cucumber and she's waiting for you buzzed like a maddening hum in his ears, making it difficult to focus on anything else. At the top of the stairs he hesitated. There was a door ajar just enough for him to see the small room inside. But it wasn't the room that caught his attention. No, it was her. The girl sitting in the center, her gaze locked on the door with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was young, with delicate features and eyes that shimmered with an almost unnerving clarity. Her skin, impossibly pale, seemed to glow in the dim light. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for far too long. Anthony's throat went dry. His curiosity surged, but so did a strange sense of foreboding. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave before he got caught in whatever web this bizarre situation was leading him into. But before he could make a move, the girl's eyes flicked to him. And there it was, a flicker of recognition. Her lips parted, her voice a mere whisper. You're here. For a moment, Anthony stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. This felt wrong on so many levels, like a dream slipping into a nightmare. I don't think I'm supposed to be here, he stammered, already regretting his decision to follow the strange trail of events that had brought him here. The girl smiled faintly, as though she knew something he didn't. Oh, but you are. You are exactly where you need to be. Her words were haunting, as if the very air around her was laced with secrets. Anthony took a cautious step forward, his gaze flitting nervously around the room. Everything about it was unsettling. The furniture, the dim lighting, the suffocating silence. The girl didn't seem to notice his discomfort, her eyes still fixed on him, as though she were waiting for something waiting for him. What's your name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isn't it obvious? She replied cryptically, standing up with grace that seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. She walked towards him, her movements slow, deliberate. I'm not the one you should be worried about. Anthony's pulse quickened. The words hit him like a cold wave. What did she mean? Who should he be worried about? The walls seemed to close in further as his breath quickened, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. She stopped just inches away from him, and her gaze softened. You've been looking for answers, haven't you? She tilted her head as though she already knew the answer. Well, you're about to find them. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Anthony felt as though he was trapped in a web of lies and hidden truths. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, there was a sharp sound, a thud coming from somewhere deeper within the house. The girl's expression flickered, and she stepped back, her eyes darting toward the door. You should go, now. Her voice was urgent, laced with a sense of terror. But Anthony couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her, from the strange, fragile creature standing before him. What was going on? Who was she really? Suddenly, the room felt colder, the shadows longer. The thud came again, this time louder, followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest. He needed to leave. He turned towards the door, but as he reached for the handle, the girl spoke once more, her voice shaking. "If you stay, you'll never leave." The words froze him in place, and before he could fully process their meaning, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Moments later, the door swung open. 2 men entered, both in plain clothes, but their presence carried an undeniable weight of authority. They moved with quiet precision, the kind of calmness that only experience could breed. The smaller of the 2 men, dark and unassuming, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Anthony. "I arrest you, Conrad Fleckman," he stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "For the murder of Anna Rosenberg. Anything you say will be used in evidence against you. Here is my warrant, and you will do well to come quietly." A strangled scream escaped from the girl's lips, her hands reaching out as though she could somehow stop the inevitable. Anthony stepped forward, keeping his composure despite the shock creeping through him. "You're making a mistake, officer," he said smoothly, his voice firm. "My name is Anthony Eastwood." The detectives exchanged a glance, their skepticism palpable. The dark-eyed man, who had spoken first, dismissed Anthony's claim with a cold wave of his hand. "We'll see about that later. In the meantime, you come along with us." "Conrad," the girl cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Conrad, do not let them take you." Anthony, with every ounce of calm he could muster, turned to the detectives. "You will permit me, I'm sure, to say goodbye to this young lady." His voice was polite, but firm, and after a moment's hesitation, the detectives nodded, stepping aside. As he drew the girl into the corner, his mind raced. The words needed to be right, the timing perfect. "Listen to me. What I said was true. I am not Conrad Fleckman. When you rang up this morning, they must have given you the wrong number. My name is Anthony Eastwood. I came in answer to your appeal because, well, I came." She stared at him, as though seeing him for the first time, her disbelief palpable. "You are not Conrad Fleckman," she repeated, as if testing the weight of his words. "No," he said softly. "Oh," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and her face turned a shade of red he couldn't decipher. "And I kissed you." Her eyes widened with horror and guilt, and Anthony couldn't help but laugh. "That's all right," he said, trying to lighten the mood. The early Christians made a practice of that sort of thing, jolly sensible. But even as the words left his lips, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was closing in. "Now look here," he said urgently. "I'll go with them. I shall prove my identity. In the meantime, they won't worry you, and you can warn this precious Conrad of yours." He turned to leave, but just as his hand touched the door, he heard her voice again. "Wait." Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. "How can you prove it?" Anthony's hand froze on the doorknob. How indeed? A new wave of uncertainty swept through him. What if the real Conrad Fleckman didn't exist at all? What if this was all some trap, a game he didn't understand? The door creaked open, and as he stepped into the hallway, the girl's desperate eyes stayed with him, burning into his back. What was the next move? As Anthony steps away from the woman, he can still feel the weight of her gaze, a mixture of longing and desperation. Her words, soft yet filled with urgency, linger in his mind. "I do like yous. I do like you. You will remember that whatever happens, won't you?" There's something so raw about the way she says it. Her breath catches between words, as though she's on the brink of saying something more but doesn't. The moment is fragile, teetering on the edge of confession, but the truth remains locked behind her lips. Anthony's chest tightens. He forces himself to pull away, taking a step back as if to safeguard both their hearts from the unspoken chaos. "I'm ready to come with you," Anthony says, his voice calm, but inside, his thoughts churn like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He's learned to conceal his emotions, but that doesn't stop the adrenaline from pumping faster through his veins. The woman's eyes follow him, not with relief, but with an unsettling silence that speaks volumes. "Will you be all right?" he hears himself ask, though he's not sure why. It's the last moment of human decency he can offer before the inevitable plunge into the abyss. She offers a faint, wistful smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach her eyes. There's more to her than meets the eye, he knows it. The two detectives, oblivious to the tension, step forward as if the world outside hasn't changed at all. Anthony watches them, still unsure if they truly believe him, or if this is just a game to them, a puzzle to solve for their own entertainment. But then, the small man speaks. "We're just following orders, Mr. Eastwood." "Detective," Inspector Verrall says, his tone professional, but there's something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. "We'll take you to the station." Anthony smiles inwardly. He knows what's coming. He's not going to the station, not yet. His mind races as he steps out into the cold, damp night of Kirk Street, and the familiar darkness wraps around him like an old, trusted cloak. The silence between them thickens, and he knows this could be his chance. He turns to the smaller of the two detectives, the one he'd pegged as more open to reason. "Inspector Verrall, don't you think it's a bit hasty? Why not come with me to my flat? I'm sure I can clear this up. Just a quick visit, 5 minutes, I assure you." Verrall hesitates. A shift in the air tells Anthony it's working. "Come along then," he says, and there's a subtle shift in his demeanor. "But remember, we'll be watching." The tension doesn't ease as they all pile into a passing taxi. Inside, the darkness feels more suffocating, as though the walls are pressing in on them. Verrall's eyes flicker from Anthony to the street outside, as if measuring the danger in every passing shadow. Anthony's pulse quickens. The game is about to take a turn. He can feel it in his bones. Every word he speaks, every glance exchanged, it's all part of a delicate balancing act. One wrong move, and everything will collapse. At last, they arrive at the apartment building, the familiar sight of Brandenburg Mansions feeling like a distant memory. He doesn't want to be here, not like this, not under these circumstances. But this is the only way. He can't let them take him, at least. Not yet. Not without answers. The elevator creaks as they ascend. The smell of stale air fills the small compartment. But Anthony doesn't notice. His mind is elsewhere. Calculating. Plotting. As the door opens, he steps out first, then pauses. The hallway is eerily quiet, as if the entire building is holding its breath. Rogers, the porter, stands by the door. He smiles at Anthony, his face filled with respect. It's a small kindness, but in this moment, it's everything. "Good evening, Mr. Eastwood," he says, tipping his cap, unaware of the storm brewing behind Anthony's eyes. "Good evening, Rogers," Anthony replies, keeping his tone light. "How long have I been living here, do you remember?" Rogers blinks, as if the question is strange. 4 years, sir, it must be." He nods knowingly. "Exactly as I thought," Anthony says with a glint of triumph in his voice. He turns to the detectives, his gaze sharp. "Well, what do you think of that?" Verrall is the first to crack a smile, but it's not a mocking smile. There's respect in it. Carter, on the other hand, merely grunts, but there's a spark of suspicion in his eyes. As Anthony opens the door to his flat, the dim light reveals an unsettling stillness. The typewriter sits on the desk, waiting, as though it's been paused in the middle of a thought, a story about to be written. But as Carter strides across the room and picks up the paper, Anthony's heart skips a beat. "The Mystery of the Second Cucumber," Carter reads aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Anthony can't help but smile. "Yes, that's one of my latest stories. Quite an amusing title, isn't it?" "Quite the puzzle, it seems," Verrall murmurs, his voice now edged with curiosity, as if something deeper is at play. He begins to pace the room, eyes scanning every inch, every small detail, looking for something that doesn't belong. But just as Anthony starts to feel the weight of the tension lifting, a new thought strikes him that freezes the blood in his veins. What if the detectives already know too much? What if the game has already changed, and he's just walking blindly into a trap? The questions start to swarm in his mind, and he knows one thing for certain: he's running out of time. There's more to this than a simple misunderstanding, and if he doesn't act fast, everything could spiral out of control. Something tells me, Verrall says, his voice dropping lower, that we haven't uncovered the whole truth just yet, Mr. Eastwood. As the door shuts behind them, the sound of the lock clicking echoes in Anthony's mind. The scene ends with a lingering question in the air. What happens next? Anthony Eastwood leaned back in his chair, sipping his whiskey, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Go on, Inspector. Indulge me. Who exactly was Anna Rosenberg? Why did I, of all people, murder her? Inspector Verrall hesitated, his professional reticence warring with the faint camaraderie that had formed during their unusual exchange. This is highly irregular, he muttered, though a hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. But seeing as you're so curious. Anthony gestured grandly with his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. Curiosity, my dear Inspector, is the hallmark of an inquiring mind. Very well, Verrall began, his voice taking on a serious tone. Anna Rosenberg was a German, Jewess who lived in Hampstead. A woman of mystery, you could say. She had no visible means of income, yet somehow she grew wealthier with each passing year. Anthony raised an eyebrow, his tone playful but intrigued. Fascinating, the exact opposite of me. I have plenty of visible income, and yet I get poorer every year. Maybe I should have taken up residence in Hampstead. Do they hand out wealth at the station gates? The inspector ignored the quip, his gaze steady. At one time, she was known to be a dealer in second-hand clothes. Ah, that explains everything. Anthony interrupted with mock enthusiasm. I once sold my military uniform after the war. It was quite a spectacular trousers, gold lace, the works. A man in a garish check suit showed up in a Rolls-Royce, accompanied by a solemn assistant with an enormous bag. He offered me £1.10 for the lot. I threw in a hunting coat and some Zeiss glasses just to hit £2. And do you know what he did? Handed me a £10 note and asked for change. Quite the businessman. Verrall gave a small, amused shake of his head before continuing, his voice growing darker. About 10 years ago, London saw an influx of Spanish political refugees. Among them was a man named Don Fernando Ferrares, his young wife, and their child. They had fled Spain under dire circumstances. Their funds were limited, and his wife's health was failing. They were desperate. Anthony leaned forward slightly, the levity in his expression dimming as he caught the shift in Verrall's tone. One day, Anna Rosenberg came to their door. Verrall continued. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out desperation, it seems. Don Fernando was out at the time, and Anna offered to buy anything of value they might be willing to sell. Verrall paused, watching Anthony closely, as if gauging his reaction. And Anthony prompted, his voice quieter now, the playful air replaced with genuine interest. The inspector's gaze was piercing. The wife hesitated. Among their possessions was a magnificent Spanish shawl embroidered with intricate patterns, an heirloom passed down through generations. It had been Don Fernando's final gift to her before they fled their homeland. Selling it was unthinkable. Yet Anna's offer was generous. Too generous, perhaps. Anthony tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. And did she sell it? She did, Verrall said, his voice heavy. But that shawl, Mr. Eastwood, carried more than sentimental value. It was said to hold a secret, something that made it worth far more than its appearance suggested. What that secret was, we don't know for sure. But shortly after the shawl exchanged hands, tragedy struck. Anthony leaned back again, his expression unreadable. Tragedy. The wife fell ill and died within weeks, Verrall said. The husband vanished soon after, and their child disappeared. No trace was ever found of them. But Anna Rosenberg grew wealthier still. Her collection of treasures expanded, and whispers began to circulate about her dealings. Some called her a collector of secrets, others a thief of souls. Anthony's fingers tightened around his glass. And now she's dead, murdered. Convenient, isn't it? Verrall's eyes narrowed. You seem very interested in this story, Mr. Eastwood. Anthony smiled faintly. Who wouldn't be? It's gripping. Don't stop now, Inspector. Surely there's more. Before Verrall could respond, there was a loud crash from the other room, followed by Carter's voice, sharp and commanding. "Inspector, get in here." Anthony's heart skipped a beat as Verral shot to his feet, his expression tense. "Stay here," Verral ordered, his tone brooking no argument. But Anthony was already rising, his curiosity too powerful to resist. As Verral stepped into the hallway, Anthony followed silently, his footsteps light. When they reached the other room, Carter was standing by the desk, his face pale, a folded piece of paper in his gloved hand. "What is it?" Verral demanded. Carter held up the paper. "It's a list of names, including Anna Rosenberg's, and they're all crossed out, except one." Verral took the paper, his brow furrowing as he read the final name aloud. "Anthony Eastwood." Anthony froze, his mind racing. The room seemed to close in around him as he stared at the inspector. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "this is certainly getting interesting." But deep down, a chill had settled in his chest. What did this mean? Why was his name on that list? And who was behind it all? The Shawl of 1,000 Flowers. Anthony Cartwright, a man of sharp wit and a keen collector's eye, sat in his armchair, his mind racing over the inspector's account. The air in the flat seemed heavy, charged with the weight of the mystery. The tale of the Shawl of 1,000 Flowers played on a loop in his head, every detail more peculiar than the last. The shawl wasn't just an embroidered masterpiece, it carried the weight of blood and betrayal. A stolen artifact, a ruined life, a curse whispered through generations. It was a story rich with greed, desperation, and murder. But what could be the shawl's hidden value? What did Anna Rosenberg's murder and Carmen Ferraris's disappearance have to do with it? Anthony drummed his fingers on the armrest, the inspector's words replaying like a haunting refrain. Something far more gruesome than that. Something which explained the whole mysterious business of the shawl. A shiver crawled down his spine. What could be so gruesome that even a seasoned inspector hesitated to finish the tale? Anthony's thoughts veered towards Carmen Ferraris. Her dark, enigmatic eyes seemed to hold the answers. He imagined her fiery confrontation with Anna Rosenberg, her voice trembling with rage as she uttered her warning about the shawl. "You have no moral right to it. The day will come when you will wish you had never seen the Shawl of 1,000 Flowers." Her words resonated like a prophecy. Anthony pictured her defiant stance, the flicker of fear in Anna Rosenberg's eyes. What had Carmen known, and where was she now? The sharp trill of the doorbell jolted him from his thoughts. Relief surged through him. Finally, the inspector was back, perhaps with the answers he so desperately needed. But as he opened the door, Anthony was greeted by silence. The flat seemed eerily still. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the hallway, the stillness pressing down on him like a weight. "Inspector," he called out, his voice echoing faintly. No reply. Anthony moved into the sitting room, only to find it empty. The furniture was disheveled, drawers slightly ajar, and yet something felt profoundly off. His eyes darted around, searching for clues, his heart thundering in his chest, and then it hit him, the absence of his beloved collection. Panic set in. Anthony rushed through the flat, his breath quickening with every step. His treasured enamels, his silver figurines, his priceless artifacts all gone. The stark emptiness of each room screamed the truth. He had been robbed. The realization brought him to his knees. He collapsed into a chair, his head buried in his hands, a groan of despair escaping his lips. How could this have happened? The doorbell rang again, cutting through his anguish. Anthony shot up and opened the door to find Rogers, his loyal servant, standing sheepishly. "You'll excuse me, sir," Rogers began hesitantly, twisting his cap in his hands. "But the gentleman fancied you might be needing something." Anthony stared at him, confusion clouding his features. "The gentleman?" "Yes, sir. Your two friends. I helped them with the packing as best I could. Very fortunately, I had 2 good cases in the basement," Rogers explained, his eyes flickering to the floor. "I've swept up the straw as best I could, sir." Anthony's heart sank. "You helped them pack? In here?" Rogers nodded, his face reddening. "Yes, sir. Was that not your wishes, sir? The tall gentleman told me to do so, and seeing as you were busy talking to the other gentleman in the little end room, I didn't like to disturb you." A cold realization struck Anthony like a blow to the chest. He staggered back, his voice trembling with rage. "I wasn't talking to him," he snarled. "He was talking to him." Rogers coughed awkwardly, shuffling his feet. "I'm sure I'm very sorry for the necessity, sir," he murmured. "Necessity," Anthony snapped, his voice rising. "Of parting with your little treasures, sir," Rogers replied, his tone meek. Anthony froze, his mind racing. Necessity? What necessity? And then it hit him, the so-called inspectors weren't inspectors at all. They had spun a web of intrigue, drawn him into their tale of the shawl, and while he had been distracted, they had cleaned him out. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and humiliation. He had been duped, outsmarted, and robbed blind. But as the weight of the loss settled in, so did a chilling thought. The shawl of 1,000 flowers. Had it all been a fabrication, a clever ruse to divert his attention? Or was there more to the story? His mind raced with questions, each one darker than the last. And what of Carmen Ferrares? Anthony rose from the chair, his fists clenched. He wasn't a man to sit idly by. If the shawl truly held a gruesome secret, then he would uncover it. He would find Carmen, unravel the mystery, and make those men pay. As he stared at the bare, disheveled flat, a fire ignited within him, a determination to reclaim not just his belongings, but his dignity. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing within Anthony Cartwright. Somewhere out there, the shawl of 1,000 flowers awaited, its secrets hidden beneath layers of blood and betrayal. And Anthony vowed to uncover them, no matter the cost. Cliffhanger ending. Anthony stepped out into the cold night air, his breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. As he turned the corner, a shadowy figure stepped out from the alley, watching him intently. In their hand was a small embroidered corner of a shawl, 1,000 flowers, intricately woven. And just like that, the game began. Anthony groaned inwardly, his mind a swirling vortex of confusion and frustration. "Those friends of mine," he began with a forced calm that barely masked his exasperation. "They've driven off by now, haven't they?" Rogers, the butler, nodded hesitantly, glancing nervously at Anthony's furrowed brow. "Oh yes, sir, quite some time ago. I put the cases in the taxi, sir, and the tall gentleman went upstairs again before they both came rushing down and drove off in a hurry. Excuse me, sir, but is something amiss?" Anthony let out a long theatrical groan that could have rivaled any stage performance. "Amiss?" he echoed bitterly. "Everything is amiss, Rogers, everything. But I absolve you of any blame. Go now, leave me to wrestle with my telephone and my destiny." Rogers retreated with a cautious bow, leaving Anthony to pace the room like a caged tiger. 5 minutes later, he was pouring his tangled tale into the ears of Inspector Driver, a no-nonsense man with an air of permanent skepticism etched onto his face. As the inspector jotted notes into his leather-bound notebook, Anthony found himself evaluating him critically. Not at all like a real inspector, Anthony mused inwardly. He's a walking cliché. The stage has ruined me for reality. Driver snapped his notebook shut with a decisive thud. "It's clear as daylight," he said. "This is the handiwork of the Patterson gang." Anthony perked up, intrigued despite himself. The Patterson gang? And who, pray tell, might they be? Driver rattled off the details with the precision of a man who had seen it all before. Big, fair-haired man, small, dark man, and the girl. The girl's the decoy sharp as a blade, and twice as dangerous. A girl? Anthony's tone sharpened. A dark girl. Spanish, perhaps. She might claim that, Driver said with a smirk. Born in Hampstead, more likely. That's their pattern. She lures the target, spins a convincing yarn, and they clean him out while he's distracted. Anthony groaned again, this time in self-directed contempt. "And my belongings?" Driver's face softened ever so slightly, though his tone remained professional. "We'll do what we can, sir, but I won't lie to you, the Pattersons are slippery as eels." As the inspector departed, Anthony sank into an armchair, his head in his hands. The silence of the room was broken only by the insistent ringing of the doorbell. Rising with a heavy sigh, he opened the door to find a small boy holding a brown paper package. "Parcel for you, sir," the boy chirped, handing it over before darting away. Anthony stared at the package in bewilderment. He wasn't expecting anything. Closing the door behind him, he returned to the sitting room and unwrapped it carefully. Inside, nestled in layers of paper, was the liqueur set. "Damnation!" Anthony exclaimed, his frustration boiling over. But as he lifted one of the glasses, something caught his eye. A tiny, artificial rose lodged at the bottom. His heart skipped a beat. The scene in the dimly lit room on Kirk Street rushed back to him. Her voice echoed in his mind. "I do like yous. I do like you. You will remember that whatever happens, won't you?" Whatever happens. Anthony's breath caught. Did she mean, was this her way of reaching out? Or was it another layer to this confounding mystery? Determined to steady himself, Anthony sat at his typewriter and fed in a fresh sheet of paper. His fingers hovered over the keys as he muttered, "This won't do. I need clarity, not fanciful imagination." Yet clarity eluded him. His thoughts spiraled into conjecture. What was the meaning of the rose? Was it a clue, a message, or simply an emblem of mockery from a woman far cleverer than he had given her credit for? The words, "the mystery of the Spanish shawl," stared back at him from the paper. His fingers began to type feverishly, the letters forming a narrative before he could second-guess himself. But as he typed, a chilling realization crept into his mind. What if the rose wasn't a clue or a jest? What if it was a warning? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. The faintest rustle reached his ears, a sound so soft it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. Anthony froze, his eyes darting to the slightly ajar door. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold, silent and deliberate. And then, the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. In the suffocating darkness, Anthony's breath quickened. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's laughter echoed faintly low, musical and haunting. "Whatever happens," the phrase looped in his mind, taunting him as he strained to hear any other sounds. The typewriter keys remained frozen under his trembling fingers, the unfinished story waiting to be told. But now, Anthony realized, the real story was unfolding around him. Cliffhanger. What is the significance of the rose? Who is lurking outside the door, and what is their intention? And most importantly, what does "whatever happens" truly mean? What do you think happened to Mr. Eastwood? Drop your theories in the comments below.